Professor Yanis Varoufakis, thank you for speaking to us.
It's a great pleasure.
This is your new book,
It is
Adults in the Room, kind of a tell-all memoir of featuring secret meetings with Larry Summers, people phoning you in the middle of the night, threatening your stepson because you're saying bad things about the bank, secret recordings from Eurogroup meetings. Why did you write this?
Primarily because the story of Greece should not really matter for the rest of the world. Greece is too small. It should matter for us Greeks. But it shouldn't really matter to you in Sweden, to the Brits, to the Americans. But Greece is a little bit like the canary in the mine. It died in order to warn the rest, the miners down the mine, that there was a systemic problem, a methane leak, let's say. And the way in which the powers that be, the liberal establishment, which is now protesting Donald Trump and Brexit and Le Pen and so on, massively mishandled the Greek crisis, is indicative of the way in which the liberal establishment has lost the plot internationally after 2008. So the reason why it is in English and why I exerted so much effort in putting it together and not just publishing a Greek book in Greece about our country's problems is because I think that it's a universal story. And it's also a kind of drama, because very often I caught myself in meetings with very powerful people who were caught up in a trap of their own making in a way that only Shakespeare can relate.
The title Adults in the Room, that comes from Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF.
At some point she said that we need adults in the room in order to have an agreement. But it's an expression that she did not invent. It's an expression that, in a sense, relates and reflects the contempt that the establishment has for the people. They refer to themselves as adults. And of course the children are the masses out there who supposedly are the source of all legitimacy in a properly functioning democracy.
So Sweden hasn't joined the euro. We had a referendum in 2003.
Thankfully.
Did we have a lucky escape?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because the euro, the idea of a common currency is splendid. But this particular common currency, the way that it's been designed, it is as if it was designed in order to first create huge capital flow imbalances, inflate gigantic bubbles, which then burst naturally. And then once you have that, you have depression in the deficit parts of the Eurozone, and deflationary forces creating the circumstances for bigots and xenophobes to rise up in the rest of Europe. This is the architectural flaws is the reason why you should not have been part of it, and we shouldn't have been part of it either.
So in your retelling of this story, the Greek bailouts, it's not about Northern Europe coming to rescue the lazy Greeks who'd been dancing all summer like grasshopper, not thinking about the future, but it's about the Eurozone rescuing French and German banks. How?
Well, look, it's very simple, isn't it? 2008, great financial crisis. All the banks went bankrupt throughout the Western world, every single one of them. In the United States, the elites and the institutions are very pragmatic. They got around the table and immediately pumped up the quantity of public money, of dollars, and effectively reflated the collapsed banks. In Europe, we had created a central bank on condition that it's not allowed to do that. So if your central bank cannot reflate the inane and deflated banking sector, and the banking sector is insolvent, the only alternative is to shift, quite cynically, the losses from the books of the banks onto the taxpayers. So the Greek bailout was nothing more than a bailout for Deutsche Bank, Finanzbank, BNP Paribas, Société Générale, the French and German banks. Between them, they had lent 200 billion to the Greek state. They were already insolvent because they had stuffed their boots with toxic derivatives from the other side of the Atlantic. And they had already been bailed out by the French and particularly the German government, and Mrs. Merkel could not go back to the Bundestag and demand another wad of money for the same banks that she had just saved. So it was packaged as an act of solidarity towards the lazy Greeks, which of course has to come attached with austerity strings, tough love. In reality, this was money that went from the German, Slovak, Portuguese, Irish taxpayer to the Greek state to go straight back to the French and German banks on conditions that guaranteed to shrink the incomes of the Greeks that were not enough to pay for the old debts, let alone for the new ones. A 10-year-old can tell you that this cannot end well.
Because in the book, you're very critical of this, obviously, but you also express understanding for why Dominique Strauss-Kahn, Christine Lagarde, even Mrs. Merkel do this at the first instance.
Understanding is not the same thing as excuse or legitimacy. I believe that whenever you talk to someone, whenever you try to negotiate with someone, you should try to see things from their perspective. It does not mean that you agree with them. It does not mean that you excuse what they do, but that unless you have this capacity to get into the shoes of the other person, then you are not going to have a civilized discussion. My discussions with Christine, with all these people, were very civilized. The trouble was that they did not have the political degrees of freedom to come clean about what they had done, because they had effected a crime against logic. Lending the largest amount of money in the history of capitalism, in absolute terms, not relative terms, to the most bankrupt state in Europe, was a crime against logic, especially when they did it under conditions of such harsh austerity that guaranteed the diminution of the incomes from which those loans... Now, of course, they didn't expect to get their money back, but they could not bring themselves to telling...
And they didn't want their money back?
Well, they wanted their money back, but they wanted other things more than the money. They wanted to preserve and maintain their own power structure. In particular, in our case, given that we opposed them, we got elected on a campaign to restructure the debt when they didn't want to restructure the debt. If they had come to an accommodation with us, a compromise, a mutual compromise, find common ground, a mutually advantageous agreement, they would have gotten more money back than they are getting now. But Spanish voters, Irish voters, Portuguese voters, Italian voters, and ultimately French voters might have gotten ideas in their heads that they could have opposed Lagarde, Merkel, Schäuble, Hollande, and so on and so forth, and achieve a better outcome. From the perspective of those who were in power at the time, this was a nightmare, and it had to be snuffed out.
So you mentioned logic. From reading the book, logic seems to be important to you. You are sort of often angry about that people are being irrational in Europe. You can't speak economics at Eurogroup meetings. I mean, you come in as an economist into sort of a very political reality, but
it's not even political.
Often reading
it's a bureaucratic reality.
Okay, bureaucratic. But often when reading this, I was thinking, why is he so surprised?
I wasn't surprised.
No?
I think that my readers are surprised. I wasn't surprised at all.
No.
I was expecting this fully. But I believe that it was important that you folks found out that in Eurozone Eurogroup meetings, which is where all the decisions about fiscal and monetary policy are made, economic discussion is banned. I don't believe that the average European voter knew that. And I think that they are aghast at the idea that those who are determining their economic future are simply not engaging with economic reality. For instance, in the Eurogroup, at some point, Wolfgang Schäuble said to me, okay, so you don't like the 4.5% primary surplus target of your country. What do you want it to be? And I said, it's not what I want it to be, it's what it can be, given the circumstances. And that target has to depend also on our investment policies, the extent to which we can close the gap between savings and investment, and of course the extent to which we can support exporters to close the gap between exports and imports, because those three numbers, the balance of payments, the budget balance, as well as the balance between savings and investments, those three have to be in equilibrium. And then 2 hours later, there were these accusations against me all over the media.
But you've been lecturing.
Was lecturing Schäuble and the rest of the... So, on economics. So economics is banned in the Eurogroup. Now that should really cause a great deal of disconcertment everywhere.
But did you think that lecturing them on economics would work?
I didn't lecture them. I answered the question.
Okay.
Remember, the question was, if you don't like 4.5% primary surplus, what would you like it to be? And I answered the question. I could not answer the question in any terms other than economic. I was not elected by my electorate in order to be a complete fool in the Eurogroup, because if I had answered in any other way, I would have been a fool. Look, let's be clear. The reason why I became finance minister is because sometime in 2011, when I first started chatting with the man who became Prime Minister in the end, my friend Alexis Tsipras, I warned him. I said to him, the moment you get elected, at the time I never imagined that I would be part of any government, let alone his. But this was a piece of advice as an economist. I said to him, the moment you get elected, there will be no discussion. The Troika will threaten to close down your banks and snuff you out, because I was predicting what I experienced. And he sort of panicked and he said to me, so what should I do if I get elected? And I started putting together a plan for how to deter the bank closures and how to force the Troika to accept the basics that were necessary for Greece's recovery. And because Alexis Tsipras agreed with my proposals, at some point he said, well, I agree with your proposals, but I don't have anyone in the party to implement them. I want you to be the finance minister. And then I had a moral crisis.
A moral crisis.
As to whether I should accept or not, and I decided to accept it, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yes. So the surplus targets of 3.5%, no country has ever managed to maintain that in the long run.
In perpetuity.
Yeah, exactly. Did you get the impression that the Troika believed that Greece would be able to do this?
They did not care.
They did not care?
Well, firstly, the IMF agreed completely and utterly with me. From the very first...
That is very clear from the book, yeah.
And they even say this now in public.
Yes,
Back then they were not saying it in public. They were saying this to me personally. Now they actually advocate it. They are campaigning for exactly what I was campaigning for, precisely to the last decimal point. I was saying not 4.5, not 3.5, 1.5. And this is the position, the formal position of the IMF today. It's a vindication with no value to me. Wolfgang Schäuble, you can read in the book, our exchange in which he, in the end, it took months of discussions. In the end, he said to me, you're right. This program is very bad for your country and you shouldn't sign it. Yeah. But his view was that in the context of the power play within the north of the Eurozone, primarily between Berlin and Paris, he would not be willing to reconsider the Greek program, even if it was a sensible reconsideration, because he was worried that that would be a signal to Paris that Paris could expect more leniency from Berlin. Mm-hmm. And the view was very simple from Berlin, from Schäuble in particular. If they want the euro, the French, he meant, they've got to accept that I'm going to veto their budget. Mm. And so Greece was collateral damage, purely collateral damage. We were being forced into a program that Schäuble knew was bad for us, and therefore he knew he wouldn't get his money back from us, because he was signaling to Paris a degree of inflexibility. Now, if anyone tries to manage the macroeconomy of Europe in this way, you end up with the mess we have. And the rise of Le Pen and the Alternative for Deutschland and the loss of credibility and trust amongst the European voters regarding the establishment.
Because Christine Lagarde also tells you at a quite early stage that this program can't work, but she still goes into this meeting and for 5 hours basically argues for the program.
Yes, indeed.
So you have all these people saying one thing, doing another. Now you're a game theorist. Can you model this? This kind of behavior?
You don't even need game theory to model this behavior, because Christine explained this to me perfectly well. Yeah. She said to me, this program can't work. But Yanis, we've put so much political capital in it that we can't go back. This is like a pre-commitment. And you have, she was telling me, instructing me, you have to accept this. And I said, no, I don't, because, you know, I was elected with a promise to my electorate not to accept something that makes no sense. So you don't really need game theory for that. You need to read Shakespeare. Yeah? Macbeth commits a crime, and then he just needs to commit a second crime to cover up the first crime, and then a third one to cover up the second one. So the more you commit crimes against logic in this case, the more you get entrenched into a big lie. So Mrs. Merkel, for instance, when she lied to the Bundestag in 2010, saying this money, this wad of money is for the Greeks, to help them, and that we will get our money back with interest. She was not believing that at the time, was she? But once she made that statement, she was caught in the trap that she had created for herself. And then it was impossible for her to go back and ask, for debt restructure, given that she had promised her members of parliament, firstly, that this was money for Greeks. It was not. It was for Deutsche Bank. And secondly, that there would be no debt restructure.
But you are trying to beat this down with logic and rational economic argument. Shouldn't you somehow have been more aware of the political reality? I mean, were there any political conditions where sort of Germany could forgive Greece's debt?
Allow me to say that not for 1 second did I believe that the power of reason and persuasion would prevail. Not for 1 second.
But you still kept going in there for 5 months?
Of course, I kept going there, and one has to speak the language of reason.
So you knew you were going to lose?
No, I knew that we would lose if we didn't have a deterrent. You need two things. You need sensible proposals and a deterrent when they try to crush you.
And your deterrent was Greece leaving?
No, not in the slightest. Firstly, the Greek state still owed 27 billion to the European Central Bank. These were bonds that the ECB had purchased in 2011. Now, the main weapon I had was the threat that if you close down my banks to asphyxiate me, which is what they did, I will immediately restructure these 27 billion, which were payable in the next 2 years. I'm going to delay payment by 40 years. Now, why was this important? 27 billion is not that much money for the Central Bank of Europe, but legally it was it was a nuclear weapon. The reason is this. The only reason why the euro survives today is quantitative easing. The fact that Draghi, since March 2015, has been printing anything between 60 and 80 billion a month, purchasing bonds and other kinds of debt. Now, you may recall that Jens Weidmann, the president of the Bundesbank, was adamant against QE and its precursor, the so-called OMT program. So much so that he personally, representing of course the Bundesbank, took the European Central Bank to the Constitutional Court of Germany in Karlsruhe and asked the constitutional judges to deem these bond purchases by the ECB legal and in violation of the German constitution. This is a very big charge. Jens Weidmann submitted 121 pages of a deposition signed by himself against this. Now, of course, the judges did what the judges do in these circumstances. They decided not to decide because it's just too difficult for them to make this decision. So they referred the matter to the European Court. And the European courts asked, summoned Mr. Draghi, who appeared in front of them, the judges, and won the case against Weidmann and Bundesbank on the basis of a pledge. And the pledge was that he would not allow any restructuring of any of the bonds owned by the ECB. This is why restructuring the 27 billion of Greek bonds, which were written in Greek law, which, in other words, all he needed was a signature from me in order to restructure them unilaterally, that would have blown up the QE program that kept the euro together. This was a nuclear weapon that we had. I never wanted to use any weapons against Europe. But if they closed down my banks, I think it was completely legitimate to say that 27 billion, well, you can't have it. So that was one part of the deterrent.
And in the end, you were not allowed to use this weapon?
Yes. But we had the only reason why I accepted the ministry was because we shook hands with Alexis Tsipras and the leading team of Syriza that it makes no sense for us to get elected. This is going along with the gist of your question. Just with good arguments and the power of persuasion, you're not going to get anywhere. There's a whole wall of denial in the Eurogroup and in the Troika. But if you have the nuclear weapon as well, the doomsday machine, if you want to call it that, then they will come to the table. And I have no doubt that they would have come to the table. Unfortunately, this is where disunity brings defeat. Our government was disunited, and members of the team signaled to Draghi, don't worry about Varoufakis, we're not going to let him haircut those bonds. And from that moment onwards, defeat was
But before that, you were convinced that Draghi would never let this happen?
I still am convinced he would not let it happen if I was allowed to do that. It was only when Draghi realized that we were not united in government and I would have had the rug pulled from under my feet that he closed the banks.
So the Greek finance minister now says that there will be negotiations about debt relief.
You know what? We've been doing this now for 7 years.
Yeah.
For 7 years I hear the same inanity. For 7 years we keep taking loans on the basis that sometime in the distant future there's going to be a debt restructure. There's no doubt that there's going to be a debt restructure. An unpayable debt does not get paid. It's really very simple. It's not a question of willpower, it's not a question of ethics, it's not in the Bible. It will not be repaid. If you're bankrupt, you cannot repay your debt, full stop. So you need a debt restructure. The only question of interest is the debt restructure going to come first, and therefore giving an opportunity to the Greek economy to recover with a reduction in tax rates, reduction in the budget surplus targets and so on and so forth, which is necessary to attract investment? Or is the patient going to die, Greece going to be Kosovized, as I say, turned into a desert, with all its young people having left, becoming an old folks' home, and then of course at the end they will cut the debt because, once the place is derelict, they will cut the debt. That's it. Now, unfortunately, my good friend Euclid, who succeeded me in the ministry, whom I know agrees entirely with every word that I just said to you, and I am prepared to testify for this in any court of law or any forum, for some reason that I cannot explain, is now adopting the language of the Troika and of the lenders who say, you take more loans now and you impose more austerity and you shrink your incomes more and one day we'll restructure your debt. Well, no sensible person believes it on this planet. And I can assure you that Euclid Tsakalotos, who is saying this now in the Ministry of Finance, doesn't believe it either. I've known him for 30 years, he doesn't believe it.
So IMF becoming increasingly critical of how it acts.
So you see the IMF doesn't believe it?
No, yes. Do you think IMF will leave the Greek program?
No.
No?
No.
Why not?
The IMF is in a right old mess, unfortunately, for a very long time now. The leadership of the IMF, which is usually European, don't really care about the IMF. They're interested in their own political careers in the future in Europe. And therefore they're utilizing the IMF against the interests of the international community that should be using the IMF for good reasons, for good causes.
Because that's how you explain the IMF's involvement in the beginning with Dominic Strauss-Kahn caring about his political career in France.
Listen, whenever I have a choice between explaining something on the basis of stupidity or self-interest, I opt for the self-interest explanation. Dominic Strauss-Kahn was a very smart man. So why did he push the IMF into a program that violated the principles of the IMF? Not because he couldn't see what he was doing, but because he wanted to be president of France. And to be president of France, he had to save the French banks from their own folly. And this is what happened.
So what about you? Didn't you make any mistakes?
Of course
we're all prone to stupidity and self-interest.
I made it.
What was your biggest mistake during these 5 months?
2 large ones.
Yeah.
First one is that I accepted, without too much criticism, the policy, the strategy of keeping our negotiating tactics under wraps. Everything I've been telling you now about the haircutting of the S&P bonds and all that, this was not something that we brought out. There was a good reason for that, or a semi-good reason, that by the time we got elected, there was already a bank run. So talking about haircutting the S&P bonds of the ECB, that would have sped up the bank run. But with the benefit of hindsight, it was a mistake not to share this strategy, this vision of the strategy, with the peoples of Europe. Not just the people of Greece, but the peoples of Europe. That's one big mistake. Because in the end, I always believed in transparency, now I believe in transparency even more. Whenever you want to do something, your voters should know what it is that you're trying to do. Not only what your objective is, but what your means are as well. And this is where Theresa May here in Britain is very badly mistaken, to keep her cards close to her chest. The second mistake I made was to sign the application for the extension of the loan agreement towards the end of February. We had a good agreement on the 20th of February in the Eurogroup, 20th of February, where Greece, our government, would be assessed on the basis of our own agenda regarding reforms. Then a few days later, the Troika took this back and they turned us back to the old failed program, at least verbally. I should have said to them, well, since you are violating the spirit and the letter of the 20th February agreement, I'm not signing this extension of the loan agreement. I hoped that our government would remain united, and we would simply be buying time to give the creditors more of an opportunity to honor that 20th February agreement. I was wrong, I should not have signed it, and that would have meant that the bank closures would have come towards the end of February, towards the end of June, and one way or the other there would have been a resolution much earlier.
So you're mentioning there was already a bank run when you got elected, because some people will say that Greece was recovering in 2014 and it was only kind of you coming in and picking a fight with the creditors that then sort of made the problems worse again.
But I can say that the earth is flat, it's just as credible.
Okay.
Greece was fading. It's been fading since 2008. Just go to any data bank and look at Greek GDP, nominal GDP in euros. And you see that it fell in 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. Every year it fell. What happened was, it was a real GDP growth in 2014. But you know why? Because real GDP, as you know, is a ratio. GDP in euros, nominal GDP, divided by an index of prices. What happened in 2014 was the prices were falling faster than incomes. And therefore, the ratio was going up because the denominator was falling faster than the numerator. But that is not a sign of recovery. That is a sign of a huge depression. When prices fall faster than incomes after 6 years of a decline in incomes, you are in the depths of depression. And to have the international press saying, oh, Greece was recovering when these people walked into government, this is just absurd. And you know what? It's also offensive to the Greek people. The Greek people didn't want to elect us. They did not suddenly become left-wing. I mean, we were a party of 4%, and then we went to 40%. Why did that happen? Because the Greeks could see that nothing was working. The people of Greece are much wiser than foreign correspondents, except, of course, you.
Of course.
They chose us because what we said made sense, and there was no recovery. The recovery was Greek recovery, as they used to call it. The Greek success story was just adding insult to the injury of the Greeks.
So who's the bad guy in this story? Because you are quite understanding. You get along with George Osborne, the British Finance Minister, even Wolfgang Schäuble, who was portrayed in the media as your arch enemy. You know, towards the end of the book, you get along, or sort of you have good discussions. Who's the bad guy?
No one.
No one.
I tried to write this book with a humanist perspective. When you watch an ancient Greek tragedy, Oedipus, who is the bad guy? There are no bad guys. But there are no bad guys. Everybody is trying to do their best. But that's the whole structure of a tragedy. The game is set up in such a way that even though everybody is trying to do their best, in the end everybody is contributing to a disaster.
So how do you change?
This was exactly how I tried to write this book. I have no doubt that Wolfgang Schäuble was trying to do his best. Christine Lagarde was trying to do her best. My Prime Minister was trying to do his best. But in the end, the game we play in Europe is bringing out the worst possible outcome for our people. And even powerful men like Wolfgang Schäuble, or women like Angela Merkel, in the end, they are caught in the trap of their own power and end up powerless. This is the stuff of true tragedy.
So how do you change Europe from being the stuff of true tragedy to something else?
By democratizing it. You see, democracy is not a luxury for the creditors. It's not something that's nice to have. The reason why democracy evolved, never perfectly and nowhere perfectly, is because it's the only way of managing a crisis. You see, during the good times, you don't need democracy. You can have a cartel structure like Europe always did. Europe is a cartel, really, of heavy industry. That's how it started, remember? It was the economic community of coal and steel, like OPEC. And then the other industries were co-opted, the agricultural sector through common agricultural policy. So when you have the United States of America minding the global shop and ensuring that there is growth internationally, which is what was going on between 1945 and 2008, really, in the global economy, and then you can have an undemocratic European Union expanding, and everybody's relatively dissatisfied and relatively happy at the same time. And the whole thing is sustainable. I mentioned OPEC. When is OPEC about to crash? When prices come down. Yeah. During the bad times, cartels cannot handle the distribution of burdens and losses. Similarly, It is now, since the crisis began, that you can see that the European Union is desperately in need of more democracy because it cannot handle the distribution and redistribution of burdens. That's why we need democracy and transparency. It is absurd that the people out there do not know what their representatives are saying on their behalf behind closed doors.
And that's why you were secretly recording the Eurogroup meetings under the table with your cell phone?
No. That's not why I was doing it. I was doing it for even better reasons than that. After my first Eurogroup, which lasted 10.5 hours, I exited that Eurogroup meeting with a head that was spinning from fatigue, from confusion, from exhaustion. Now, I consider myself to be, and I was, a representative of the Greek people and the Greek government in there. The future of the nation depended on what was being said during that meeting. I was threatened by the president of the Eurogroup with bank closures on that meeting, during that very, very first meeting. Now, I had a responsibility towards my prime minister, my cabinet, my parliament, and the Greek people to come out and answer questions as to what was said in there. And I remember, once the press conference was finished, I asked my secretary for a copy of the transcripts, of the minutes. And she called me 10 minutes later saying, Minister, I asked the Secretariat and there are no minutes.
So it was for your own memory?
Of course it was for my own memory. I had a duty to be able to report to Parliament. Parliamentarians would ask me, this is what happens in democracy. They said to you, so what did Schäuble say to you when you said that? And what was the precise wording of what you said to Schäuble when it is a question of national survival for a place like Greece? And I had no idea. I would have to say, you know what, I can't really remember. I have a hazy recollection because I was tired. So after that, I started recording. And then, once the Brussels correspondents began to spread huge lies about what was said to me, about what I said in meetings, recording my conversations was the only defense against this kind of toxic lies.
And it then became this book as well. Thank you.
You're most welcome.